Hi there, my name is Simon Stump, and I design games as a hobby. I have one published wargame called Illyria, and I'm working on a new one, which for now I'm calling the Wizard game. Illyria had a written blog, but this time around I decided to keep a design video log. For my first video, I'm going to talk about the design goals for the game and how I've been developing the basic structure of a turn. So like Illyria, this new game is going to be a miniature agnostic skirmish game. Basically, I'll sell people the rules, and they can use the minis and dice and things that they already have. Like Illyria, I want this game to be really unique and different. Illyria did this by having a 3D chess element where you fought on multiple interconnected boards. For the Wizard game, I've developed a really neat combat system that I'll talk about in a future video. I also wanted to limit the runaway winner effects that can happen in wargames, and I wanted to lean into input randomness whenever possible. So what do I mean by input randomness? Well, randomness can be broken into input and output randomness. Input randomness is where the randomness happens before you make your decision, and usually it limits your options for the turn. So one example is backgammon. In that game, you roll the dice before you choose which pieces to move. So once you do that, what moves you can make are determined randomly, but your choices have deterministic outcomes. Output randomness is randomness that happens after you make your decision. And usually this determines whether the action succeeds or not. You could do this in like an alternate version of backgammon by picking which piece before you roll your dice, and then rolling the dice to see how far they move. Wargames mostly lean into output randomness. You generally declare a unit to attack, and then roll to see the outcome. There are a handful of exceptions, however, such as Undaunted, where the cards you draw at the start of the turn tell you which units can act. But those exceptions are pretty rare, and so I wanted to try that for this game. Okay, so how did I lean into input randomness? Well, I thought for this video I'd talk about how I did that in structuring a turn. My first prototype had a deck building mechanic in it. Both players had decks of cards, and at the start of the game, most or all the cards would blank. During the turn, a wizard could cast a spell from the deck if they had one, or they could add a new spell to their deck. For example, maybe on turn 1, all the cards that the wizard drew was blank, so you'd spend your first turn adding Magic Arrow and Shield to the deck. On turn 2, you drew Magic Arrow, which means you could cast it but not Shield. I thought this was a neat mechanism where you could trade actions now for better actions in future turns. And I also liked that the spells weren't consistent, because it's produced varied turns, but you could plan around the randomness. But I didn't like that it relied on cards that you'd have to make. This just didn't feel right for a miniatures agnostic game, since it seemed like too much to ask players to make their own cards. I thought this might work well in a prepackaged game, and I might do that in the future, but for now I'm setting it aside. So I tried a second version of this with dice. Basically, at the start of your turn, you'd roll 3 dice, which would determine what spells you could cast. At the start of the game, there'd be no spells to cast, but you could load them in throughout the game. So maybe on turn 1, you'd make 1 a magic arrow and 3 a shield. If you rolled a 1 on the next turn, you could use that 1 to cast magic arrow. I'm not sure what it was, but this just lost some of the magic that the cards had. I think it was because keeping track of everything got too complicated and just felt too clunky. I also felt like it distracted from the rest of the game, rather than adding to it, so I'm not using this design. For part 3, I tried a version where dice had set effects, so maybe a 5 or 6 was always Magic Arrow, and that didn't vary throughout the game. There were 2 design choices I could make here, random or hierarchy. For the former, every power had an essentially random number, so maybe Fireball was 1 to 2, Magic Arrow was 2 to 4, Shield was 4 to 6. There wasn't any best number. This definitely gave the game a Winds of Magic feel, but it felt too much like you were just reacting to your roll and not making any interesting decisions. For example, if you rolled a 1, a 4, and a 6, it meant you got a Fireball, a Shield, and 1 choice, Magic Arrow or Shield. I liked the feel, and I might use this for another game, but again, it felt like it took away from the other elements of the game, so I'm not using it here. The other option was to make a hierarchy. So Fireball is a good spell, so you need a 5 or higher to cast it. Magic Arrow is an okay spell, so you need a 3 or higher, and so on. This meant 6 gave you all the options, and 1 meant you could only do the most basic thing. This ended up leading to interesting decisions, because when you rolled a 6, you had to decide, who got to use the 6, which unit got it, which effect did they do, that sort of thing. There were a lot of interesting decisions there. And then I actually figured out how to make it more interesting, which is to make the weaker attacks go first. This led to a really interesting trade-off, where if you want your unit to make a strong attack, they had to risk being killed before they could make that attack. So I tried a few different versions of this, and here's the current draft. At the start of the game, you get 4 cards labeled 1 through 10. I picked cards so there would never be a tie. I figured most people have a deck of cards, so that didn't seem unreasonable. Small numbers go first, but big numbers are stronger. I also simplified the system so that there was just weak, normal, and strong actions. The extra details turned out to just not be worth the complexity. Also, even though players would draw 4 cards, they would only play 3 and they'd have to discard 1. This creates an interesting decision at the start of the turn. Do I want to act quickly or powerfully? And this decision gives you a little bit more control over the input randomness. I had one concern about this last step, which is that potentially it wouldn't actually be an interesting decision because players would just always discard the low number or always discard the high number. So this took some tuning, but in a recent playtest, it looked good. For example, here is the results from my last playtest. Here are the cards that each player drew, and here are the ones that they chose to discard. So as you can see, there's been a slight bias towards discarding numbers, but a clear mix with sometimes discarding the low cards, sometimes the middle, and sometimes the high, suggesting that this is really a non-trivial decision. And that's where I'm at right now. I have the basic turn structure that I'm building the rest of the game around, and now I need to work on the other systems. So thanks for watching, and cheers until next time.